Minor disclaimer about this set of boss guides. This was recorded on the PTR, and it's entirely possible that mechanics look, behave, or are tuned differently when they're released on live servers. In addition, I'm trying something new here by releasing these guides as one video, and I've also cut the TLDR section. Let me know what you think about these changes in the comments below and how I can improve these guides in the future. With all that said, let's begin with the first boss, Plexus Sentinel. Plexus Sentinel is a two-phase introductory boss that is almost entirely single target focused. Now before we get started, you will need to have your Reshi Wraps acquired and equipped in order not to die in a mechanic on this boss, which I will explain a little bit later. One thing you'll immediately notice is that behind the boss is this energy wall. If you touch the wall, you'll most likely be one-shotted unless you use a personal. Do not touch the wall. In addition, when the fight starts, a wall will spawn behind the raid as well, constraining the space you have to work with. Move out to the edge of the room if you are affected by manifest matrices, as when this debuff expires, you'll drop a displacement matrix, a circle that if you touch it will stun you and any players within 8 yards, as well as leaving a slowing void zone on the ground. The boss will target a random player with Eradicating Salvo. This player needs to move close to melee, as this is a split damage soak that will knock back any players that help soak. How we mainly dealt with this in testing is you move close to melee and have them soak 1, and then that player moves backwards towards range and they soak the second hit. Move out of these purple swirlies that the boss makes to avoid taking unnecessary damage. For tanks, you'll want to move away from the raid with Obliteration Autocannon, as it does drop off damage and leaves a huge void zone when you get hit. Ideally, you want to stack these in the same spot in order to conserve space. Since the tank is going to be slowed standing in the potent mana residue after dropping off the tank mechanic, you should have a Life Grip, Blessing of Freedom, or something similar to help them get back and reduce the damage they're taking. When the boss reaches 100 energy, he will knock the whole raid back and then teleport further into the room. As he does this, he will remove the wall that was there before and place a new one behind him, as well as spawning many traps in your path that you'll have to navigate. There are two main traps: energy cutters, which are these line things, and expulsion zones, which are these bubbles. The cutters just do a lot of damage if you touch them, and expulsion zones will knock you back as well as doing damage. I did notice in testing, however, that the knockback has a cooldown, so if you have a mobility skill like lighter than air or something, you might be able to just walk through the bubble. Every time the boss does this intermission, the maze that he creates is a set pattern, so you'll sort of get used to where you need to get past, but make sure to save some speed buffs like Windrush Totem or Stampeding Roar for this. Now, you know how I said you needed your Reshi Wraps earlier? This is why. The boss will send a wall that slowly moves towards the raid. In order to dodge this, you'll need to use your extra action button. This will activate your Reshi Wraps to warp you forward through the wall, leaving you unharmed. You can also use this to navigate other obstacles, so try to look out to see if you can avoid the wall, as well as a bubble at the same time, to save you some time traveling. I also wanted to mention that you're able to use this extra action button in phase 1 as well. In heroic testing, I was able to use it after being knocked by the group soak to soak the second hit. This is entirely unnecessary. I just wanted to mention this because I thought it was neat. From here on, you'll navigate the maze and break the absorb shield that the boss has, as damage he does to the raid ramps up over time. After you break the shield, you revert into phase 1 again and repeat. I did want to highlight this boss's inner rage as it's pretty cool. After 3 intermissions, you will have reached the far edge of the room. From here, the boss may cast Cleanse the Chamber, which will spawn a wall you need to Reshi Wraps through. The trick here is that he will cast this back to back at times. This means if you ever end up reaching this point in the fight, you may need to drag the boss back towards the entrance to allow you the time to be able to go through these walls. That sums it up on heroic. On mythic, there are a few changes. Eradicating Salvo needs to hit at least 5 players or it will do large damage to the raid. The boss will periodically cast Cleanse the Chamber, which will cause a wall to spawn at the far end of the room and slowly move towards the raid. This will require the raid to use their Reshi Wraps in phase 1 to get through it. The largest change, however, comes in the intermission. Volatile manifestations will spawn in set locations. These low health ads need to be killed before the wall reaches them, as if it does, the ad will explode for large raid damage that also applies a debuff that increases the damage you take from this by 100%. Since these spawn in set locations, you can pre-assign melee and range to kill this as they are traveling. As a monk, I was able to pre-place my Transcendence to make it easier to travel to them as well. And that's Plexus Sentinel on heroic and mythic difficulty. Moving on to the next boss, Loom'ithar. Loom'ithar is a 2-phase encounter where the boss starts suspended in the middle of the room. It will then begin casting Layer Weaving, which will create a slow-moving ring of invulnerable infused tangles that move towards the middle of the room. If you touch this ring, you'll take massive damage and be rooted. you need to have the tank aim the piercing strand mechanic towards one of these tangles to make them vulnerable. Once it's vulnerable, everyone should swap to it immediately, as killing it will give you a free lane to escape. Around when this is happening, Loom'ithar will mark several players with infusion tethers. These players will receive a ramping amount of damage and be pulled towards Loom'ithar. To break the tether, you need to move 40 yards away, which will snap it and leave a void zone on the ground called Living Silk. Be careful not to snap your tether in any existing Living Silk, as doing so will stun you. Loom'ithar will cast Over Infusion Burst when it reaches full energy, which requires you to move to the edge of the room, as this does huge damage when the cast finishes. From here, you just rinse and repeat until the boss reaches 50% health. At 50% health, Loom'ithar will begin pulsing arcane energy and push players back before ripping itself in half and falling from the ceiling, dealing a large amount of physical damage to the raid, and making it take 25% more damage for the rest of the encounter. From here, this is Phase 2. Phase 2 is pretty straightforward. The tank mechanic it does will be replaced with Writhing Wave. This is a group soak aimed at the tank that deals a decent chunk of nature damage. Players who soak gain a 25-second debuff, which increases the damage they take from soaking by 300%. As a result, you'll need 2 groups of players set up to rotate between each soak. Loom'ithar will cast Arcane Outrage, which will push everyone back while pulsing arcane damage. When the channel finishes, a growing void zone will spawn underneath the boss. Dodge these circles that spawn from Primal Spellstorm. These can spawn as you're being pushed back by Arcane Outrage, so make sure to keep an eye out. From here, you just want to slowly move the boss around the room while rotating soak groups for the tank funnel and trying to conserve as much space as possible before the boss dies. Since the boss takes 25% bonus damage in this phase, it makes the most sense to save Bloodlust for P2. That sums up the fight on Heroic. On Mythic, there are a few changes. Loom'ithar will summon an additional ring with lair weaving, meaning you need to have the tanks aim at 2 different tangles. Ideally, they hit the one closest to the first one you exposed. While this is happening, the boss will activate infusion pylons in the room. Shortly after being activated, these pylons will begin to shoot a beam at the boss. If the beam successfully hits the boss, Excess Nova will occur, dealing a moderate amount of raid damage. At the start of the fight, the boss will just activate 1 pylon, but then in subsequent activations will start to activate 2, and then finally 3 pylons at the same time. You want to assign players to intercept these beams to prevent this from happening. Players who soak will gain stacks of Hyper Infusion, which increases the damage they take from soaking by 100% for 10 seconds. The pylon will deactivate after 20 seconds, and it applies a stack of the debuff to a player soaking every second. During testing, we found this wasn't dealing a ton of damage, and you could just assign a mage, and through their combination of defensive usage and focus healing, they could survive easily. Important to note that tangles can overlap with this mechanic, making range more preferable because they'll be able to hit the tangles while soaking. Another reason mage seemed good as well is because if the beam soak wasn't near where you were breaking tangles, they could just blink through the tangles while still soaking the beam. In P2, the boss will place these circles around every player during Arcane Outrage, which explode and deal AoE damage when Arcane Outrage finishes channeling. Just make sure to spread out. And that's Loom'ithar on Heroic and Mythic difficulty. Moving on to the next boss, Soulbinder Naazindhri. Soulbinder Naazindhri is an ad-heavy boss fight with frequent cleave, with heavy bouts of burst at 2 minutes and 4 minutes 30. Shortly after you pull the boss, you'll notice a bunch of ads spawn in set locations in binding chambers around the room. It will begin channeling a long spell called Soul Weave. When this channel finishes, any ads that were not killed will break free of their binding chamber and spawn. Now how do you kill them? Well, the boss will target 2 players with Soul Fray Annihilation, indicated by these purple lines. After 6 seconds, the debuff will expire and the boss will shoot a large orb towards where those lines were aimed. If this line is aimed towards the cages, the orb will destroy the binding chamber, making the ad attackable and cause them to receive 200% increased damage. Whenever a cage is destroyed or expires, it triggers Essence Implosion, which deals a decent amount of damage to the raid. Make sure if you are targeted by these lines that you are behind the binding chamber you want to hit, as the orb projectile is pretty fast, and if it's intercepted by a player, it won't hit the binding chamber and will deal a ton of damage to the player and cause them to take 20% more damage for 15 seconds. Soulfire Convergence will create these Kaiveza-like shapes around several players. This debuff deals damage over time, and players affected need to move away from the raid, as when their debuff expires, it will shoot these small, slow-traveling orbs out in the indicated directions. If you are hit by one of these orbs, it will apply a dot and slow you for 15 seconds. Arcane Expulsion will deal raid damage, apply a dot, and knock everyone back based on their location relative to the boss. The raid will want to position itself to get knocked towards the next set of binding chambers you want to destroy to make raid movement easier. As mentioned earlier, right around the 2-minute mark in the fight, the Soul Weave channel will finish for the remaining adds and they will spawn. This will also trigger a massive essence implosion. There are 3 different kinds of adds: Shadowguard Assassins, Shadowguard Mages, and Shadowguard Phase Blades. Each type of add has its own set of abilities and different health values. Shadowguard Assassins will target a random player with Void Blade Ambush, which will do some damage and apply a dot. Shadowguard Mages will spam cast Void Burst. Make sure to interrupt this and have a few DK raid buffs available to get these mobs into melee quicker. And Shadowguard Phase Blades will truck your tanks with auto attacks and cast Phase Blades, which deals a small amount of damage to all players. From here, AoE down these adds, and then the fight will repeat where the boss will summon another set of adds inside binding chambers. That sums up the fight on Heroic. On Mythic, there are a few changes. In order to break the binding chambers with the large orbs, you need to hit them with a small orb from the Kai'Veza-shaped mechanic first. When the boss knocks players away, each player will create a puddle where they land. This includes, if you try to glide or something to cancel the knockback, it will create a puddle wherever your feet next touch the ground. This means that instead of getting knocked to where you want to go, you want to get knocked to the side and then move into the next area. From what we could tell, these puddles last the entire fight, so place them intelligently. Getting hit by a small orb on Mythic will also lower your haste by 25% while the debuff persists. Lastly, each add that spawns in is enhanced in some way. Assassin's targeted dot thing is an AoE indicated by a circle. You should move away from other players with it. The Mage's Void Burst cast time is halved every time they are interrupted, and the Phase Blades will gain a stacking 7% damage buff the longer they are alive. That does it for Soulbinder on Heroic and Mythic difficulty. Moving on to our next fight, Forgeweaver Araz. Forgeweaver Araz is a 2-phase encounter that involves controlling adds and controlled DPS that ends in an absolute cinema last phase. First thing you'll notice is that there are 3 pylons placed around the room in a triangle formation. These are a key part of this fight, and shortly after Araz is pulled, he will cast Invoked Collector, which will activate one of these pylons, causing it to shoot out circles you'll need to avoid. The pylons are targetable and attackable, but they have a 99% damage reduction while they are in this phase. Astral Harvest will debuff several players that when it expires will spawn an orb add that will start to move towards the pylon that cast it, indicated by these purple lines. If these orbs reach the pylon, they'll explode for huge raid damage. Fortunately, these adds are fully CCable. If you are affected by this debuff, you want to position yourself on the far side of the boss so that the orbs have to travel through the boss to reach the pylon they're moving towards, allowing them to get easily cleaved down. Silencing Tempest will debuff several players and cause them to leave circles on the ground where they are currently standing. And if you stand in them, they will deal damage to you and silence and pacify you for 6 seconds. The boss will target the current tank with Arcane Obliteration. This is a group soak that will deal damage to all players, but the damage is reduced by the number of players in the soak. Players who soak also get a big healing absorb placed on them and a debuff preventing them from soaking for 1.3 minutes. It will also spawn an Arcane Echo in the location of the soak. This is a weaker copy of the boss that needs to be tanked at least 20 yards away from the boss, as if they are close, they both deal 75% more damage and take 90% reduced damage. This Echo will copy certain spells the boss casts when he casts them, specifically Invoke Collector, which will create more circles to dodge, and Silencing Tempest, which will debuff even more players, making more swirlies to move out of. This Echo should be a priority target while it is alive, as it creates a lot of unneeded chaos while it's alive, and it can persist in the intermission. How we dealt with this is we tanked the priority target at the time in the middle of the room, so people could stack their orbs from Astral Harvest on it, and then just rotated the boss in after the Echo died. When the boss reaches 100 energy, he will cast Arcane Expulsion, which will deal a large amount of raid damage and knock everyone back as he begins his intermission. During the intermission, Araz has a 99% damage reduction and is untargetable. Instead, all 3 pylons will activate and have their damage reduction removed. The pylons will start to be marked with this circle. These indicate that the chosen pylon will start to rapidly accumulate energy. When a pylon reaches full energy, it will cast Arcane Convergence and shoot a beam towards the middle of the room, which will deal huge damage to the raid. Ideally, you want to look out for which pylon is being activated and have people swap and kill it ASAP, then move on to the next marked pylon, and so on until all 3 pylons are destroyed. The boss will also spawn 2 shielded attendants when the intermission starts. These need to be tanked and gain a sacking 8% attack speed buff for every consecutive melee attack on the same target, meaning you'll need to taunt swap at some point. It will also periodically gain an absorb shield. These attendants can be tanked in front of pylons that reach full energy to intercept the arcane convergence beam. This will stun the attendant and deal about 20% of its HP and damage. Once all 3 pylons are destroyed, the ritual will be disrupted and the boss will cast Mana Sacrifice. Shortly afterwards, he will gain a 100% damage taken debuff for 12 seconds. From here, you'll re-enter phase 1 and repeat. Make sure to finish off the attendants as their tank damage is significant and they do need to be killed. When the boss reaches 15% HP or completes the intermission a second time, he will cast Dark Terminus. This will create a sucking black hole at the far end of the room that will gradually suck you harder and harder. If you touch the black hole, you'll take a lethal amount of damage every second until you die. As for other changes in this phase, Astral Harvest is replaced by Void Harvest. This will spawn void manifestation orbs that slowly move towards the black hole. If they reach it, they will explode for huge damage. You want to have these players pixel stack on top of the boss to give you free cleave, but the focus target should be the boss, as eventually the pull from the black hole will be too strong to outrun. That sums up the fight on Heroic. On Mythic, there are a few changes. Orbs spawned from Astral Harvest have a 99% damage reduction and move 99% faster until they reach a Void Tear. Void Tears are spawned right before Astral Harvest goes out, and the orbs need to pass through these in order to remove their damage reduction, after which they become CCable and killable like normal. We noticed in testing that Void Tears spawn in one of 3 places in this triangular formation, and the pylon that spawns them will spawn the Void Tear in the furthest place in that triangular formation away from it. Astral Mark now lasts 10 minutes, requiring you to soak with fewer players on a Heroic, which will increase the damage the raid takes from the group soak. In the intermission, each pylon needs to be killed at the same time, otherwise it will start exploding. The timing for this was pretty tight in testing, as if you were only a few seconds slow, it would most likely result in a raid wipe. And that's Forgeweaver Araz on Heroic and Mythic difficulty. Moving on to the next boss, Soul Hunters. Soul Hunters is the optional boss for this raid and is a 3-target sustained cleave council fight. These bosses do not share HP and need to be killed at the same time. Each Demon Hunter boss represents a spec of Demon Hunter, with Alyssa Dark Sorrow representing Vengeance, Valarin Bloodwrath Havoc, and Adaris Dustblaze, the secret 3rd Void-themed DH spec. As a result, each one has abilities that may sound familiar. We'll talk about Alyssa Dark Sorrow first. Her main mechanic is Fracture. This will apply a standard tank swap debuff and shoot out 2 spirit fragments of that player behind them. While these fragments are active, that tank will take 33% reduced healing per fragment. To prevent this, other players need to walk over and soak the fragment. This will apply a nasty dot for 30 seconds that can stack, so you need to have 2 different players soak it. It's important to mention that other players need to soak these, as the tank that was affected cannot help with this mechanic. And we noticed during testing that AMS prevented the application of the dot, making DPS DK pretty good for soaking them. Alyssa will then cast Spirit Bomb shortly afterwards, which applies a healing absorb to the raid, and if any soul fragments were not soaked, it will apply a raid-wide dot per unsoaked fragment as well. In testing, this dot didn't really do that much damage, but I would imagine this will be buffed as the in-game journal indicates it's supposed to be lethal. Moving on to the Havoc Demon Hunter boss, Valarin Bloodwrath. Valarin's main mechanic is the Hunt. She will vengeful retreat backwards before choosing a random target and making them the primary target for the Hunt. That player needs to extend their line far enough for players to soak, as the Hunt will deal huge damage to that player that is reduced by the number of players in the line. The trick here is that when you soak the line, you'll see these green circles pop up. These circles indicate that you will cleave anyone standing near you, so you need to soak this line while also spreading within it. This mechanic could be immune, from what we could tell, but she casts it often enough where that wouldn't be a great permanent solution. Valarin will cast Blade Dance, which will create these green lines you need to move out of. These can be deceptively fast at times, so make sure to watch her feet. She will cast Eye Beam at her current threat target, which will push the tank back and apply a stacking debuff called Fell Singe that increases the damage taken by Eye Beam. Bear in mind, this is a frontal, so this needs to be aimed away from the raid. Lastly, we'll talk about Adaris Dustblaze, the mystery 3rd Demon Hunter spec representative. Adaris is the only one of the 3 bosses that cannot be tanked, and similar to Pip on the Council of Dreams encounter in Amirdasil, will just teleport around the arena and cause havoc. When the fight begins, he will begin a long cast called Devourer's Ire. This will create 2 soak circles on the ground, which when the cast finishes will apply the Devourer's Ire debuff. If these are not soaked, they will instead just deal raid wiping damage. Devourer's Ire is a permanent magic debuff that increases physical damage taken by 100%. In addition, the boss will cast Consume, which only affects players who have the Devourer's Ire debuff. Consume deals damage, inflicts a Healing Absorb debuff, and applies Unending Hunger, which is a separate stacking 1-minute debuff that increases damage taken from Consume by 20%. Now the trick here is when you dispel Devourer's Ire, it will deal raid damage and bounce to the closest player. So you need to juggle these debuffs, preferably between your healers or ranged, before Unending Hunger stacks up too much. Adaris will occasionally reposition himself with Void Step. When this happens, the tank should drag the other 2 bosses to where Adaris went for efficient cleave. As he travels with Void Step, he will create images of himself that create these void pools on the ground called Encroaching Oblivion. Encroaching Oblivion deals damage and increases damage taken by 30% while you stand in it. Players affected by Devourer's Ire can stand in these void pools to shrink and eventually remove them from the fight. When the bosses reach full energy, one of them will enter Metamorphosis form and begin an intermission. While this is happening, the other 2 bosses will be inactive but attackable in the area nearby. After a boss completes their intermission, you'll re-enter phase 1 until they reach 100 energy again. In testing, these happen in a set order: Adaris, then Valarin, and then lastly Alyssa. Each of these is different, so I'll cover them one by one. Adaris will jump to the middle of the room and begin channeling Collapsing Star. This will slowly pull players towards him while spawning these orbs at the edge of the room. If any orbs reach him, they will explode and deal huge damage to the raid. You need to have players soak these, but be careful as soaking one deals damage and applies a stacking dot. In addition, you cannot touch the area underneath Adaris, as that does lethal damage as well. During Valarin's intermission, she will jump to the middle of the room and begin channeling Fell Rush. This will create blaze lines on nearby players. Like every other blaze mechanic, try to minimize movement, and if you have to move along your blaze line. Lastly, during Alyssa's intermission, she will choose a random location far from her and Infernal Strike to it indicated by a green circle. She will then face towards the raid and cast Fell Devastation. It will deal a bunch of damage every 0.5 seconds for 4.5 seconds. It will also apply a stacking debuff that slows you. You want to save any movement speed cooldowns for this intermission, as the cone for Fell Devastation is pretty wide, and more immobile classes like Priest are going to be going through it without them. Finally, as I mentioned earlier, you have to kill these bosses at the same time. If you kill one early, it will spawn a big soul crystal and begin pulsing raid damage every 4 seconds. Every time this crystal pulses, it deals 25% more damage. However, if you take too long and you reach the enrage timer, all 3 bosses will enter Metamorphosis and begin all 3 intermissions at the same time. It's possible to survive this for a bit, but since it lasts forever, you're going to want to end the fight as soon as possible. That sums up the fight on Heroic. On Mythic, there are a few changes. Alyssa will now cast Sigil of Chains. This will grip the entire raid, regardless of distance, towards Alyssa's current location and slow them. This is dangerous because it always happens right before the hunt, which makes this combo a lot more chaotic than Heroic. There's also one more soul fragment to soak from Fracture. Alyssa also had more HP than the other 2 bosses when we tested Mythic. I'm unsure if this is an intended Mythic change, or if this is a change they made to all difficulties, as Mythic raid testing was the last footage we have of these fights. Valarin's hunt cast will now happen 3 times in succession, with a roughly 3-second gap in between them. These extra hunts will target different players, and in addition, the hunt will now apply a debuff called Weaken Prey that increases the damage you take from soaking the hunt by 500% for 10 seconds. The best way we saw to deal with this was just to have the lines not be intersecting and have players who do not have a debuff or are currently soaking to move into the new hunt, as there's usually not much else going on when this mechanic happens. For tanks, the debuff applied by I-Beam will also increase the damage taken from Fellblade, meaning you'd want to taunt swap before I-Beam finishes channeling to prevent taking a ton of extra damage. Adaris will cast Eradicate, which will cause images of him to teleport around and deliver telegraph frontals you'll need to move out of. Lastly, in each intermission, every player will be affected by Soul Tether. This links 3 players together and will yank them back together if they remove more than 14 yards apart. This can complicate how you approach each intermission somewhat, but it's important to identify who you are tethered to, as there will be a definitive left, middle, and right player. And that's the Soul Hunters on Heroic and Mythic difficulty. Moving on to the next boss, Fractillus. Fractillus is the Tetris boss. He is a large, immobile rock guy who will continually spawn walls of rock in these lanes. If you put 6 walls in a single lane, the boss will enrage and wipe the raid. To start off, I want to note that while I'm going to explain what all these mechanics do, it is heavily implied in testing that this boss will be primarily solved through use of weak auras. While I personally didn't use these assignment weak auras in the testing that I did, you can see here in this clip from Northern Sky how effective these will be. With that said, let's get into the mechanics. Fractillus will target several players with Crystalline Eruption. This is a 10-second debuff that when it expires will shoot a wall out from Fractillus that will collide with any players and then the Nether Prism in the lane you're standing in. When I refer to lanes, I mean these white lines that emanate from the boss when he starts to cast these mechanics. When you are hit by one of these walls, they apply a nasty stacking dot. So if you're targeted by this, you want to move to the marker you're assigned to and avoid hitting the raid with the wall. Fractillus will affect several players with Shatter Shell. This is an 8-second debuff that when it expires will root you for 4 seconds. Fractillus will then follow this up with Shattering Backhand, which will knock those rooted players back into the walls, which will then destroy them. Destroying the walls will apply a raid-wide dot and trigger null consumption, which will create these swirlies on the ground to move out of and create these large spread circles around players. It's important to note for range players spreading with these circles that if there's a free lane without any walls in it, you can go behind the crystal there and spread to give more room to the melee. Lastly, the tank mechanic on this fight is Shockwave Slam. This will spawn a wall in the lane the tank is in and apply a debuff that makes them take more damage from Shockwave Slam for 55 seconds. From here, you just rinse and repeat, making sure to prevent 6 walls from stacking up in any single lane. Usually this revolves around having an assigned safe spot that may change throughout the course of the encounter, people fanning out to the other lanes if they get chosen by the mechanics. On Mythic, there are a few changes. There's a new type of wall called Brittle Nexus that when broken applies a raid-wide dot. Lastly, Shockwave Slam now creates 3 walls instead of 1. And that's Fractillus on Heroic and Mythic difficulty. Moving on to the last boss for the purpose of these guides, Nexus-King Salhadaar. As a disclaimer before we get into Nexus-King, I'll just be going over the heroic version of this fight as nobody publicly made it very far on this fight on Mythic, and by the time most guilds reach it, there will be plenty of resources available to dissect. Nexus-King Salhadaar is an encounter with many different damage profiles and cool visuals that takes place over 3 phases and 2 intermissions. Phase 1 lasts about 2 minutes, or until the boss reaches 50% HP. To start off the fight, Salhadaar will channel Decree Oathbound, which will apply 3 stacks of Oathbound to all players. You need to remove all 3 stacks of this permanent debuff before this phase ends, otherwise the boss will cast Invoke the Oath, which will mind control any players who have remaining stacks of Oathbound. In addition, if you ever do die on this fight with any remaining stacks of Oathbound, you will also become mind controlled for 12 seconds. Being mind controlled in this fight is bad for a few reasons. Besides the obvious, the boss will cast random CCs like Mass Root or Leg Sweep on players that don't expect that to happen, and if you don't kill the mind controlled players before the debuff expires, they will explode, dealing huge damage to the raid. Now going back to Oathbound, how do you remove these stacks? The tank combo Subjugation rule. This tank combo always consists of 2 spells, Vanquish and Conquer. He will repeat these spells once, but the order of these spells is entirely random. So he could cast Vanquish 2 times in a row and then cast 2 Conquers in a row. Vanquish is a large frontal cone the tank needs to aim away from the raid as it does huge damage and knocks back any player's hit. It also applies a debuff that increases the damage taken by Vanquish by 100% for 20 seconds. Conquer is a group soak that deals split damage, knocks players up, and removes a stack of Oathbound, as well as applying a debuff that increases the damage taken by Conquer by 100% for 20 seconds. The idea here is to have 2 groups on either side of the boss and have the tanks take 1 Conquer and 1 Vanquish each, while the rest of the raid soaks 1 Conquer each to remove Oathbound stacks. Salhadaar will periodically command the Void Dragons that line the perimeter of the room to do something. This comes in 2 flavors, Besiege and Behead. Behead will apply a debuff to several players that when it expires will deal damage and create a claw-shaped void zone. These kind of work like Blaze where the line is static, so you kind of want to drag this in the same direction that your line is facing. In addition, it will knock you back in the direction of the swipe. The siege will make the closest dragons to Salhadaar disappear, and then they will shoot these moving beams in the direction the dragons were facing. These beams do a ton of damage, so make sure to avoid these. Lastly, Salhadaar will affect several players with banishment. This just deals damage over time and then explodes for damage at the end. Viewers will want to watch these players, as the damage from this combined with another mechanic may be dangerous. As I said earlier, once Salhadaar reaches 50% HP or 2 minutes have passed, you will enter intermission 1 by casting Coalesce Voidwing. You want to move out of this before the cast finishes, as it deals huge damage and it will knock all players back regardless if they are in it or not. Salhadaar will then mount the Royal Voidwing and cast Netherbreaker on several players, where he will throw his mace and it will bounce to each player, dealing damage to them and creating a portal. We weren't exactly sure on how these portals worked and just decided to drop them on the edge of the room to be safe. The Royal Voidwing will then cast Dimension Breath on its primary target, which is a frontal beam effect. This beam effect will be echoed through each portal that was placed by Netherbreaker earlier. You want to avoid being hit by these beams, but as they rotate, it's better to pop a DR and walk through one quickly than try to avoid one only to get hit anyway. Dimension Breath will apply Dimension Glare to the primary target, which will deal damage to the whole raid based on how much damage that target took from Dimension Breath. Just have the tank pop a defensive cooldown here to reduce damage to the raid, as this did wipe us once or twice in testing. To end this intermission, Salhadaar will cast Rally the Shadow Guard. This will open up 2 portals on either side of the room. You want to split your raid up in half and have them walk over and use their extra action button to be transported to the platform. On each platform, you'll be met with the same amount and type of enemies. There will be a Nether Prince, which has an interruptible cast that you want to have a kick order assigned to, 4 Shadow Guard Reapers, which are just jobber ads, and a Manaforge Titan. You need to focus down the Manaforge Titan, as if it reaches full energy and finishes its self-destruct cast, you will die. The Manaforge Titan will also cast Dread Mortar, which are these swirlies you'll need to move out of. The Nether Prince will also cast Nexus Beams. This creates 3 beams that rotate around him slowly. Just avoid these. Once each side successfully kills all their ads, the teleport back to the main platform will open up. I want to note that if any side finishes killing all their ads first, the boss will progress to the next phase, so ideally you sync up your kill times to have both groups return at the same time. Also, in testing, if one group returned earlier than the other, it was possible that one of the Shadow Guard ads would teleport onto the main platform, which would prevent that group from returning onto the main platform until it was killed. From here, Phase 2 will continue until Salhadaar reaches about 25% HP, and the boss will continue casting Netherbreaker, Dimension Breath, as well as the Behead Blaze mechanics from P1, and the fight will be 2-target cleave. Once he phases, he will teleport off the Voidwing and begin channeling King's Hunger and gain Regal Ward. Regal Ward will reduce the damage Salhadaar takes by 99% while he's channeling, and King's Hunger will increase the damage taken on the Voidwing by 100%, as well as pulsing damage onto the raid. While he's channeling, the Voidwing will be positioned in the middle of the room and spawn these lines you need to move out of. After 30 seconds, or if the Voidwing reaches 40% HP, King's Hunger will complete and Salhadaar will heal himself equal to the remaining HP of the Voidwing and begin Phase 3. Salhadaar will open up Phase 3 by casting Galactic Smash. First, he will target several ranged players with a 12-second debuff, and you'll notice a clockwise rotating swirly around your character. Then, he will target several melee players with an 8-second debuff that gives them a counterclockwise rotating swirly. You'll want to spread these out evenly, similar to Kaiveza, as when the Galactic Smash cast finishes, he will create dark stars where those players are located, which will try to pull you towards its center. If you have too many on one side, you'll be pulled off the platform. When the dark stars are created, each one will begin rotating in the direction mentioned earlier and shoot out these void rings that will increase in size every time they erupt. Avoid these as best as you can, and ideally there's always a safe spot near the boss to stand. The boss will spawn 2 images and then target 3 players, the current tank, 1 ranged and 1 melee, with Star Killer Swing. These players need to aim this line towards one of the dark stars, as when it makes contact with a dark star, it will destroy it and then apply a dot to the players that were targeted. If Star Killer Swing doesn't make contact with a dark star, it will then instead apply a massive raid-wide dot that will most likely lead to a raid wipe. From here, it's rinse and repeat as you continue to dodge out of the dark star AoEs and aim your Star Killer Swings towards them, and then the boss creates new ones with Galactic Smash. At around 7 minutes and 25 seconds into the fight, Salhadaar will cast World in Twilight. This is similar to Smolderon's Enrage, where rings of twilight spikes slowly engulf the arena. And that sums up Nexus-King Salhadaar on heroic difficulty. I want to thank you for watching these guides. I hope they helped, and I'll see you next tier.